Hi, 8th grade students. This is Mrs. Guido, and this is a recording of the chapter called The Sit-Ins. The quote at the top: "If it's possible to know what it means to have your soul cleansed, I felt pretty clean at that time. I felt as though I had gained my manhood, so to speak, and not only gained it, but had developed quite a lot of respect for it." This is from Franklin McCain, one of the Greensboro Four. On the last day of January 1960, a North Carolina teenager named Ezel Blair Jr. announced to his mother, "Mom, we are going to do something tomorrow that may change history, that might change the world." Blair attended a black college in Greensboro called North Carolina Agricultural and Technical. On Monday afternoon, February 1st, he and three A&T classmates, Franklin McCain, David Richmond, and Joseph McNeil, went downtown to Woolworth's department store, took a seat at the lunch counter, and ordered a donut and coffee. "I'm sorry," said the waitress. "We don't serve you here." Take a look at this picture in the center of the page. The caption reads, "Protesters picket Woolworths during a sit-in." "Though white-only lunch counters were a fact of Southern life," one of the students replied, "we just beg to disagree with you." Before sitting down, they had deliberately bought some school supplies. Holding up a receipt, they pointed out that they had just been served at a nearby cash register. One of the most insulting hypocrisies of segregation was that stores in the South, as Franklin McCain put it, "Don't separate your money in this cash register, but no, please don't step down to the hot dog stand." The youths sat at the counter for an hour. They were heckled by a black dishwasher and stared at by a white policeman. An elderly white woman cheered in a loud whisper, "You should have done it 10 years ago." The store manager turned off the lights at 5:30, half an hour before closing time. By then, McCain recalled, we had the confidence, my goodness, of a Mack truck. In a week, the Greensboro Four had grown to hundreds. Within 2 months, protests had taken place in 125 cities in 9 states. Take a look at this picture. The caption underneath the photograph. From left, Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, two of the Greensboro Four, stage a sit-in at Woolworth's. The store desegregated its lunch counter on July 25, 1960. A new dimension. The sit-ins, as the lunch counter campaign became known, sparked a freedom flame that had been barely flickering since the Montgomery bus boycott ended in 1956. Between 1957 and 1960, there had been scattered student sit-ins, mostly outside the old Confederacy, but black colleges had never been hotbeds of activism. Critics accused them of merely turning out James Crow, PhDs, black people who wanted to do well as opposed to do good. Yet it made perfect sense for college kids to take the lead. As movement soldiers, they had big advantages over the grown-ups. No job to lose, no family to support, easy communication with one another at school, hormones that made them fearless, and fewer years of absorbing the damaging effects of segregation. Plus, twirling on a stool at a soda fountain, an activity only white kids got to do, still seemed like freedom itself. At the time, Martin Luther King Jr. had just turned 31. The main thing he and the movement's other veterans had accomplished since the bus boycott was to form a preacher-led group of Southern activists called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. SCLC's do-nothingism thus far had come to frustrate one of its founders, Fred Shuttlesworth, a hothead hot-headed Baptist minister from Birmingham, Alabama. When Shuttlesworth visited one of the North Carolina sit-ins that February, he called SCLC headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, the hometown to which King had recently returned. "You must tell Martin that we must get with this," Shuttlesworth said to the staff director, Ella Baker. "And really, this can shake up the world." The sit-ins were, as Shuttlesworth said, a new dimension. In the previous mass movement, the bus boycott, the protesters had not disobeyed the law they considered unjust. They simply stayed off the buses. This form of protest is called passive resistance because it doesn't confront the system head on. What was different about the sit-ins was that the kids were actively disobeying segregation laws that they felt were unfair and immoral. This direct action, or civil disobedience, had been one of Gandhi's favorite methods in India. With the exception of Shuttlesworth, the ministers of SCLC had shied away from direct action, partly because if you broke the law, you might have to suffer the consequences and go to jail. Proud prisoners. For a black college student hoping to move up in the world, going to jail was especially humiliating because whites tended to stereotype blacks as criminals. But as the sit-in spread outside North Carolina and the police started making arrests, going to jail for the movement became a badge of pride. One of the goals of Gandhian nonviolence was to, quote unquote, fill the jails with political prisoners so that the unjust laws being broken could no longer be enforced. Students had already taken over lunch counters in Nashville, Tennessee, as well as in Virginia, South Carolina, Maryland, and Kentucky, when sit-in fever reached King's Atlanta. He found himself torn between the feisty kids and the more cautious older black leaders, particularly his father, Daddy King, who were trying to put the brakes on the protests. After much soul-searching, on October 19, 1960, King went with some college students to the Magnolia Room restaurant at Atlanta's finest department store and got himself arrested. This photograph here, the caption below, Martin Luther King Jr., holding his 2-year-old son, Martin Luther King III, observes a cross that was burned in his yard in April 1960 after the sit-ins spread to Atlanta. The jailing of King set off a national uproar. Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy took time out from running for president to telephone King's wife, Coretta Scott King. That gesture was at least partly responsible for swinging the black vote that won the presidential election for Kennedy 2 weeks later. The pattern of King's career and the dynamics of the civil rights era had been established. King was the man who could command the spotlight and get the results, but he often needed the young people, like those lunch counter pioneers, to push him to the next frontier. On the last page, the title is The Birth of SNCC. Once they launched the sit-ins, the students decided to organize into a movement that would take the struggle beyond the lunch counters and go after, quote unquote, more than a hamburger. But should the students become a youth arm of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or should they form their own independent group? On Easter weekend of 1960, college kids from around the South came to a meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina, to sort out the future of the young people within the civil rights movement. Some of the SCLC's members, particularly Ella Baker, were critical of how their organization revolved around King. They were impressed with the students' quote-unquote group-centered approach, with no single person in charge and decisions made democratically. Although SCLC put up $800 to make the Raleigh conference happen, The 300 students voted to remain separate from SCLC and make their own way to freedom. The new group they formed was called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It would be known as SNCC after its initials. SNCC, or SNCC, became the most important movement organization next to King's own SCLC. For some of those present at SNCC's creation in Raleigh, the most memorable thing about that meeting was an old gospel hymn that they had learned. Back in the 1940s, striking Black workers had sung it on the picket line. It was a quote-unquote powerful, welling thing, said one reporter at the SNCC meeting. Soon that song, "We Shall Overcome," became the anthem of the civil rights movement. This is a picture of Ella Baker, one of the creators of SCLC. She engineered the formation of SNCC as a separate student group and remained its favorite adult advisor.